All right, welcome. So if you're studying political science, liberalism is a word you are going to hear over and over again. But what does it actually mean? It's a tricky one because it can describe someone who loves free markets and someone who supports a big government. In this explainer, we're going to break it all down, untangle that confusion, and look at liberalism's origins and its two major competing branches.
So let's start with that big question. What does liberal even mean? In Europe, it often means someone who's all for free markets and a small government. But then you hop over to the United States, and it can mean the complete opposite, someone who wants government programs and regulation. So how on earth did one word end up representing two totally contradictory ideas?
Well, the best way to get your head around this is to think of liberalism like a family. They all share a last name, a common ancestor, and this core belief in individual liberty. But over time, two major branches of this family grew so far apart that they started to look like they weren't even related. So let's trace that family tree, starting right from the roots.
All right, so let's start right there, with that common ancestor. Because to really understand where the two branches split, we first have to get a handle on what they actually share. At its absolute core, liberalism is a political ideology that was born out of the European Enlightenment. You can think of it as a shield. It was designed to protect the individual from the overwhelming power of the state or the church or the monarchy. It did this by championing things like individual rights, a government with limits, and the rule of law.
You see, liberalism didn't just pop up out of nowhere. It was a revolutionary idea forged in the intellectual fire of the Enlightenment, or the Jnanodaya Yuga. It was a direct rebellion against this centuries-old idea that kings had a divine, God-given right to rule. Thinkers like John Locke came along and argued that no, society should be based on human reason, not on some divine command.
And that brings us to, one of the rock stars of liberal thought, John Locke. He argued that every single person has natural rights that exist before any government is even created. Those famous rights are life, liberty, and property. And this is the absolute game changer, right? The government doesn't give you these rights. Its only legitimate job is to protect the rights you already have. This was a radical idea at the time.
So all of this thinking, it created the very first major branch of the family, classical liberalism. You can think of this as the original blueprint, the first design for a society built entirely around this new idea of individual freedom.
Classical liberalism is really defined by a deep, deep skepticism of power. It says that individual liberty is the most important political goal, period. And to get there, government has to be strictly limited. It's a necessary evil that should only be there to enforce contracts and protect people from things like force and fraud. This leads right into laissez-faire economics, which, is basically French for leave it alone, trust the market.
So if you boil it all down for a classical liberal, the formula is super simple. Maximum individual freedom means minimum government. Freedom in this original sense is all about not having other people, especially the government, interfering with your life. But, of course, history never stands still, right? The world started to change, dramatically. And those changes posed a serious challenge to that classical liberal blueprint, which is what gave rise to the second major branch of the family.
Think about it. The Industrial Revolution created unbelievable wealth, sure, but it also led to just brutal poverty, dangerous working conditions, and massive inequality. And then came the Great Depression. These huge events showed a pretty big crack in the original design. This whole hands-off approach had no answer for these huge systemic problems. And people started asking a really powerful question. What good is being free from government interference if you're not actually free to get an education, or find a decent job, or even see a doctor?
And this is where modern liberalism, sometimes called social liberalism, came in with a totally different answer. It still cared about individual liberty, but it argued that real freedom means more than just being left alone. It pictures an active government, one that works to create social justice and equality of opportunity, using things like a mixed economy, social safety nets, and protective rules.
Okay, let's do it. Let's put these two branches side by side. This is where that family feud gets really clear. And for any political science student, understanding these differences is absolutely crucial. So the biggest, most fundamental fight between them is over the very meaning of the word liberty. Classical liberals are all about negative liberty. That's freedom from outside barriers. But modern liberals, they focus on positive liberty. That's the freedom to actually achieve your potential. And they argue that to have that, you need certain conditions in place, like education and healthcare. And this huge disagreement completely changes how they see government.
You see, for the classical liberal, the perfect government is like a night watchman. It's just there to make sure nobody's breaking in. That's it. But the modern liberal sees the government as an enabling force, a tool that can be used to help people overcome obstacles and reach their goals.
And as you'd expect, this massive split carries right over into their ideas about the economy. Classical liberals say laissez-faire, let the market do its thing. They believe the invisible hand is the best way to create prosperity for everyone. But modern liberals look at that and say, no way. They argue that unregulated markets create way too much inequality and instability. They think the government has to step in, regulate things, and provide safety nets to build a fairer society.
Okay, so that's the global picture. But how does this whole debate actually look here in Nepal? Because even though the party names are different, this tension between these two liberal ideas is very, very much alive in Nepali politics.
Right off the bat, you're not going to find a big political party in Nepal that calls itself the Liberal Party. The political scene here is really dominated by socialist and communist ideologies, but that does not mean liberal ideas aren't around. In fact, they've been incredibly influential.
I mean, just take a look at the 2015 Constitution, the Sanvidan, its entire foundation, the guarantee of fundamental rights like freedom of speech, religion, and association. That's pure classic liberal thinking. The push for a secular state, that's also deeply rooted in the liberal idea of separating state power from religion. And more recently, you've seen parties like the Rashtriya Swatantra Party come along pushing for a lot of liberal ideals like good governance and individual freedom.
But of course, not everyone's on board. Liberalism gets a lot of pushback in Nepal, really from both sides of the spectrum. From the left, you'll hear socialists and communists argue that free market policies would just make the rich richer, benefit a small elite, and create huge inequality. Then, from the right, you have conservatives and nationalists who worry that all this focus on the individual could wear away a traditional Nepali culture and a sense of national unity.
Whew, okay, so we've traced this entire family tree, from its roots to its two big branches, and even how it shows up in Nepal. So, what do you really need to remember from all of this?
First, always remember that family analogy. It's one family that believes in liberty, but with two branches that completely disagree on how to get there. Second, the core fight is all about the role of the government, and that fight is fueled by the clash between negative and positive freedom. And finally, remember, this isn't just some old historical debate. It's a living, breathing argument that shapes politics everywhere, including right here in Nepal.
And that really leaves us with a big question to think about. As we face these huge 21st century challenges, things like rising inequality, climate change, massive technological shifts, which vision of liberalism actually offers a better path forward? Is it the minimal state of the classicals or the enabling state of the moderns? Or does our future demand a whole new branch on that family tree? That's something to think on.